You think you know everything about the dystopian classic that gave us cinema's most shocking food revelation? Think again. Behind this 1973 sci-fi thriller lies a treasure trove of bizarre production secrets, tragic real-life parallels, and Hollywood oddities that are stranger than fiction itself. Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about Soylent Green. Fact 1. Edward G. Robinson's heartbreaking final performance. When Edward G. Robinson stepped onto the set of Soylent Green in 1972, he was carrying a devastating secret that would transform his performance into one of cinema's most poignant final acts. The legendary actor, known for his tough guy roles in films like Little Caesar and Key Largo, knew he was dying of bladder cancer, but he chose to tell only one person on the entire production: his longtime friend and co-star, Charlton Heston. Robinson had worked with Heston 16 years earlier in The Ten Commandments, and their friendship had deepened over the decades. In his journal, Heston later wrote that Robinson never missed an hour of work and was never late to a call, maintaining his reputation as the consummate professional even while battling terminal illness. What made this situation even more heartbreaking was that Robinson's character, Saul Roth, dies in the film through assisted suicide, choosing to end his life rather than face the horrors of their dystopian world. The cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew the truth. Robinson's death scene in the movie, where Saul peacefully passes away while watching beautiful images of nature from the past, became his real-life farewell to acting. Director Richard Fleischer had deliberately scheduled all of Robinson's scenes to be filmed first, unknowingly giving the dying actor a chance to complete his work without the stress of a prolonged shoot. Soylent Green marked Robinson's 101st film, a remarkable career milestone that would also be his final curtain call. He died on January 26, 1973, just 10 days after completing his final scene and 4 months before the movie's release. Heston remained haunted by the knowledge that Robinson's last day of acting was spent filming his character's death, creating an unforgettable intersection between art and life that few films have ever achieved. Fact 2. The title confusion with Danny Thomas. One of Hollywood's most bizarre title changes happened because studio executives were worried about a long-forgotten sitcom from the 1950s. The original science fiction novel that inspired Soylent Green was called Make Room, Make Room, by author Harry Harrison, a title that perfectly captured the book's theme of dangerous overpopulation in a dying world. However, when Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer bought the film rights, they immediately decided the title had to go. The studio's concern was that audiences might confuse Harrison's dystopian thriller with Make Room for Daddy, the original title of Danny Thomas's popular family sitcom that ran from 1953 to 1956 before becoming The Danny Thomas Show. Making matters even more confusing, there had been a short-lived sequel called Make Room for Granddaddy that aired for just one season in 1970, only about a year before Soylent Green went into production. Harry Harrison was not happy about this decision, and he made his feelings known when he visited the set during filming. According to reports from the time, Harrison showed up one day and handed out copies of his original book to everyone he could find, from the actors to the crew members. When Charlton Heston received his copy, he immediately called across the set to director Richard Fleischer, asking why they weren't using Harrison's much better original title instead of what Heston called the crappy Soylent Green. Harrison later reflected on this situation with obvious frustration, explaining that the decision was made in high places and that director Fleischer probably didn't even know the real reason behind the title change. The author concluded his thoughts on the matter with a bitter observation that became something of a Hollywood maxim: when you throw away a good title, you always get a bad one. Fact 3. First video game in movie history. Soylent Green quietly made history by featuring the very first video game to ever appear in a Hollywood film, though most viewers at the time had no idea what they were looking at. The game was called Computer Space, and it appeared in several scenes throughout the movie as a piece of futuristic entertainment that fit perfectly into the film's vision of the year 2022. Computer Space was created by Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney in 1971, making it the first commercially available arcade video game in history. The game was housed in a striking fiberglass cabinet with curved, futuristic lines that looked like something straight out of a science fiction movie. This sleek design made it an obvious choice for the Soylent Green production team, who needed props that would look believable as advanced technology 50 years in the future. The version that appeared in Soylent Green was a custom white computer space cabinet, which was different from the typical colorful versions that were sold to arcades. The game itself was a simple space combat simulation where players controlled a rocket ship and tried to shoot down flying saucers. But for most movie audiences in 1973, the concept of interactive electronic entertainment was completely foreign. What makes this appearance even more interesting is that Computer Space wasn't actually a successful game in the real world. While it launched the video game industry and led Bushnell to create Atari and develop the much more successful Pong, Computer Space itself was too complicated for most players and never caught on with the public. However, its futuristic cabinet design was so perfect that it seamlessly blended into the movie's dystopian world. There's even a funny story about how one of the game's creators, Ted Dabney, went to see Soylent Green when it was released and was completely shocked to spot the Computer Space cabinet on screen, though he later admitted that his business partner Bushnell came to the movie late and completely missed seeing their creation in the film. Fact 4. Heston's daily gourmet gifts for dying co-star. While Edward G. Robinson kept his terminal cancer diagnosis secret from almost everyone on the Soylent Green set, Charlton Heston knew the truth and responded with an extraordinary gesture of friendship that turned Robinson's final working days into something resembling a gourmet celebration. Every single day that Robinson was scheduled to film, Heston would arrive on set carrying carefully selected wines and cheeses from around the world, creating a daily ritual that brought moments of joy to his dying friend's last professional experience. This wasn't just a casual gift here and there, but a deliberate and sustained effort by Heston to make Robinson's remaining time as special as possible. The production had wisely scheduled all of Robinson's scenes to be shot first, which meant that every day Robinson worked, he could look forward to Heston's thoughtful selections of fine foods that represented the kind of luxuries that had disappeared from the dystopian world they were creating on screen. The contrast between these real-world delicacies and the processed food rations that dominated their fictional universe added an extra layer of meaning to their shared meals. In the movie, Robinson's character Saul Roth constantly reminisces about the wonderful foods that existed before the environmental collapse, describing fresh strawberries and real beef to his younger partner, who has never experienced such things. Meanwhile, behind the cameras, Heston was providing Robinson with exactly those kinds of rare and beautiful foods that the character could only remember. The friendship between the two actors dated back to their collaboration on the 10 Commandments in 1956, and this daily tradition represented the deep bond they had developed over the years. Robinson's professionalism during filming was legendary, as he never missed a call time or showed any signs of the illness that was quietly consuming him, making Heston's gesture all the more touching as a way to honor both their friendship and Robinson's dedication to his craft. Fact 5. Robinson's deafness created filming chaos. By the time Edward G. Robinson began working on Soylent Green, his hearing had deteriorated so severely that he was almost completely deaf, creating a series of awkward and sometimes comical situations that the cast and crew had to navigate throughout the production. The legendary actor could only hear people when they spoke directly into his ear, which meant that normal film set communication was virtually impossible for him. This hearing loss created particular challenges during dialogue scenes with other actors, since Robinson couldn't hear their lines, or pick up on the natural rhythm of conversation that makes film dialogue feel realistic. The solution required multiple rehearsals before each take, where the other actors would practice their timing and delivery so that Robinson could memorize the rhythm and flow of the scene, allowing him to respond as if he could actually hear what was being said to him. The most persistent problem came from Robinson's inability to hear director Richard Fleischer when he called cut at the end of a scene. This led to numerous situations where filming had stopped, the cameras were no longer rolling, and the other actors had relaxed and stepped out of character, while Robinson continued performing his role completely unaware that the scene was over. Crew members would have to physically approach him or use visual signals to let him know that filming had concluded. Despite these technical difficulties, Robinson's professionalism never wavered, and he found ways to work around his disability that allowed him to deliver a powerful performance. The cast and crew adapted to his needs without complaint, understanding that they were witnessing the final work of a true Hollywood legend. Robinson's dedication to completing his scenes despite his physical limitations became part of the film's behind-the-scenes lore, demonstrating the kind of old-school professionalism that defined his generation of actors who had learned their craft during Hollywood's golden age. Fact 6. Last film shot on decaying MGM backlot. Soylent Green holds the distinction of being the final film shot on Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's legendary backlot in Culver City, California, and the timing couldn't have been more perfect for creating a convincing dystopian wasteland. By 1972, when filming began, the famous studio system had collapsed, and MGM had allowed their once pristine backlot sets to decay and fall apart, creating exactly the kind of deteriorated urban environment that the movie needed to represent New York City in the year 2022. The backlot's New York street sets, which had been used for countless classic films and television shows over the decades, were now crumbling and neglected, with peeling paint, broken facades, and an overall atmosphere of abandonment that perfectly matched the film's vision of a world in environmental collapse. Instead of having to spend money on elaborate dystopian set decoration, the production team discovered that MGM's neglected backlot already looked like a post-apocalyptic nightmare. The cinematographers took advantage of this decay by filming at unusual angles that deliberately showed the incomplete facades and supporting framework of the sets, rather than hiding these technical elements as they would have done in a normal production. This approach gave the street scenes an unsettling quality that made the fictional future city feel genuinely unstable and falling apart, adding to the overall sense of societal breakdown that drives the film's story. Shortly after Soylent Green completed filming, the entire backlot was demolished in 1973 to make way for modern developments including assisted living communities, condominiums, and office complexes. This means that audiences watching the film today are seeing the final recorded images of sets that had been home to countless Hollywood productions during the studio system's golden age, making Soylent Green not just a science fiction thriller, but also an unintentional documentary of a vanishing piece of movie history. Fact 7. The silent chase was contractual. The climactic chase sequence in Soylent Green is completely silent, with no dialogue whatsoever, but this wasn't a creative accident or a result of production problems during filming. Writer Stanley R. Greenberg deliberately wrote the chase scene without any spoken words because he was determined to prevent the film from turning into a typical action movie, and he made sure that his vision would be protected by including a specific clause in his contract. Greenberg's contract contained an unusual provision that prevented anyone from adding or editing dialogue in his screenplay, which meant that once he decided the chase would be silent, no one could change that decision during production or post-production. This kind of contractual protection for a writer's creative choices was relatively rare in Hollywood, where scripts are usually considered collaborative documents that can be modified by directors, producers, or even actors during the filmmaking process. The writer's concern was that adding typical action movie dialogue like shouted threats, breathing heavily, or characters calling out to each other would transform what was meant to be a suspenseful thriller into just another generic chase scene. By keeping the sequence completely silent except for ambient sounds like footsteps, gunshots, and the creaking of the old church where the final confrontation takes place, Greenberg forced the audience to focus on the visual storytelling and the mounting tensions rather than being distracted by unnecessary talking. This creative decision creates an almost dreamlike quality during the chase, where Detective Thorne runs through the empty, curfew-enforced streets of future New York while being pursued by corporate assassins. The silence makes the sequence feel more like a nightmare than a typical Hollywood action scene, which perfectly fits the film's overall tone as a dark warning about environmental collapse and corporate control rather than an adventure story with a clear-cut hero saving the day. Fact 8. Real oil refinery as food factory. The terrifying Soylent Green manufacturing facility where Detective Thorne discovers the horrifying truth about the green wafers is actually the Chevron oil refinery and power plant located at 300 Vista Del Mar in El Segundo, California. And this massive industrial complex is still operating today, looking almost exactly as it did when the movie was filmed 50 years ago. The production team chose this location because its towering smokestacks, maze of pipes, and imposing industrial architecture perfectly captured the kind of massive, impersonal factory that would be needed to process food for 40 million people in a dystopian future. What makes this location choice particularly striking is how well the oil refinery's actual purpose mirrors the dark themes of the film, since both oil processing and the fictional Soylent Green production represent industrial processes that transform natural resources into products for mass consumption. Though obviously, the movie's version involves a much more sinister transformation than anyone could have imagined. The refinery's intimidating scale and mechanical complexity made it an ideal stand-in for a facility capable of the large-scale food processing that the Soylent Corporation would need to feed New York's enormous population. For the interior scenes where Thorne witnesses the actual production process, the filmmakers used the Hyperion wastewater treatment plant in Playa del Rey, which provided the pools and processing areas needed to show the shocking final stages of Soylent Green manufacturing. This combination of two different industrial facilities created a convincing picture of a massive operation that could believably handle the logistics of feeding millions of people, even if the source of the protein was far more disturbing than audiences initially realized. Today, visitors to the El Segundo area can still see the Chevron facility and immediately recognize it from the movie, making it one of the most accessible filming locations from Soylent Green for fans who want to see where this pivotal scene was shot. Fact 9. Dick Van Patten's embarrassing line flub. Dick Van Patten had a small but important role in Soylent Green as one of the ushers who escorts Edward G. Robinson's character Saul Roth to his death at the government euthanasia clinic. But what should have been a simple one-line performance turned into a comedy of errors that required multiple takes because Van Patten was completely starstruck by the legendary actor. Van Patten's only line in the entire movie was supposed to be, "This way, mister." Roth, as he guided Robinson's character toward the room where he would peacefully end his life. However, when the cameras started rolling, Van Patten was so overwhelmed by the presence of the Hollywood icon that he completely forgot he was supposed to be addressing Robinson's character and instead said, "This way, mister." Robinson. Director Richard Fleischer immediately yelled, "Cut! Cut! Don't call him Mr. Robinson," and they had to reset the scene and try again. Van Patten later admitted that he was so in awe of Robinson, who had been a major movie star since the 1930s, that he couldn't separate the man from the character. Unfortunately for Van Patten, his nerves didn't settle down after the first mistake. And when they attempted the scene a second time, he made exactly the same error, once again calling the character by the actor's real name instead of his fictional name. The crew had to stop filming again and give Van Patten a moment to collect himself and focus on the script rather than his excitement about working with such a famous performer. Finally, on the third attempt, Van Patten managed to get his single line correct, though he later described the experience as one of the most embarrassing moments of his career. This incident became part of the film's behind-the-scenes lore, demonstrating just how much respect and admiration Robinson commanded from his fellow actors, even those who were only working with him for a few minutes. Fact 10. The $150 strawberry jam profit. One of Soylent Green's most shocking details involves a tiny jar of strawberry jam that Detective Thorne discovers in a wealthy apartment, which Saul Roth explains costs $150 in their dystopian version of 2022. When the film was released in 1973, this price seemed completely ridiculous to audiences who could buy strawberry jam for less than $1 at their local grocery store, making it seem like an absurdly exaggerated example of how expensive food would become in the future. However, when you adjust that $150 price tag for inflation from 1973 to today's money, that small jar of jam would actually cost almost $900 in current purchasing power. This means that what seemed like an impossibly high price nearly 50 years ago would actually represent an even more extreme luxury item by today's standards, showing just how dramatically the filmmakers were trying to illustrate the economic collapse that would accompany environmental destruction. The strawberry jam serves as a perfect symbol for everything that has been lost in the movie's world, since it represents not just the disappearance of fresh fruit due to environmental collapse, but also the extreme wealth inequality that allows only the richest people to afford any connection to the natural world that once existed. When Thorne tastes the jam, he's experiencing something that most people in his world have never had and will never be able to afford, making it more precious than gold or diamonds. This detail becomes even more meaningful when you consider that Saul Roth constantly tells stories about the abundant food that existed when he was young, describing fresh strawberries as one of the simple pleasures that disappeared when the environment collapsed. The fact that strawberry jam has become a luxury item worth hundreds of dollars perfectly captures how completely the world has changed from the natural abundance that previous generations took for granted. Fact 11. Filming stopped for Max Fleischer's death. Production on Soylent Green came to a complete halt for an entire week in September of 1972 when director Richard Fleischer received devastating news that his father, the legendary animator Max Fleischer, had died at the age of 89. Max Fleischer wasn't just any animator, but one of the most important pioneers in the history of American animation, having created some of the most beloved cartoon characters of the early 20th century, including Betty Boop, Popeye the Sailor, and Coco the Clown. The elder Fleischer had revolutionized animation during the 1920s and 30s by developing innovative techniques that brought a new level of realism and fluidity to cartoon movement, making him a major rival to Walt Disney during animation's golden age. His Fleischer Studios produced some of the most technically advanced and artistically sophisticated cartoons of their era, including the groundbreaking Superman animated series that set the standard for superhero animation for decades to come. For Richard Fleischer, losing his father during the production of what would turn out to be one of his most important films created an especially poignant moment in his career. The younger Fleischer had followed a completely different path from his father, choosing to work in live-action films rather than animation. But he had built an impressive reputation directing science fiction and fantasy movies, including 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Fantastic Voyage, and The Boston Strangler. The timing of Max Fleischer's death on September 11, 1972, came right in the middle of Soylent Green's production schedule, forcing the entire cast and crew to pause their work while Richard Fleischer dealt with his personal loss. This week-long suspension of filming was a significant disruption for a major studio production, but it demonstrated the respect that MGM had for their director during this difficult time in his life. Fact 12. The priest's hidden communion message. One of the most subtle and disturbing moments in Soylent Green occurs when Detective Thorne visits a Catholic priest to learn what the murdered executive William Simonson had confessed before his death. And the priest makes a cryptic reference to how Jesus would taste. But most viewers miss the dark religious symbolism that the filmmakers embedded in this scene. The conversation between Thorne and the priest takes place in what would have been the altar area of the church, which is the exact location where a priest would normally perform the sacrament of Holy Communion for his congregation. During Holy Communion, Catholic priests distribute small wafers and wine to worshipers, which, according to Catholic doctrine, through transubstantiation, literally become the body and blood of Jesus Christ, meaning that Catholics believe they are actually consuming the physical essence of their Savior during this ritual. The priest's oblique reference to Christ's taste, delivered from the altar where this consumption would take place, creates a deliberate parallel to the film's shocking revelation that Soylent Green is made from human bodies. The priest cannot directly reveal what Simonson confessed because of the sacred confidentiality of the confessional, but his comment about Jesus represents his attempt to hint at the truth without breaking his religious vows. By suggesting that Christ would taste a certain way, he's trying to guide Thorne toward understanding that Soylent Green involves the consumption of human flesh, just as communion involves the consumption of Christ's flesh, though obviously in completely different contexts and with entirely different meanings. This religious imagery adds another layer of horror to the film's central revelation, because it connects the industrial cannibalism of the Soylent Corporation to one of Christianity's most sacred rituals, suggesting that the dystopian society has perverted something holy into something monstrous. The fact that this conversation happens at the altar makes the parallel even more explicit for viewers who understand the religious symbolism involved. Fact 13. Mike Henry's voice was completely dubbed. Actor Mike Henry appeared in Soylent Green as Sergeant Kulosik, one of Detective Thorne's fellow police officers, but if you listen carefully to his performance, you're not actually hearing Henry's real voice at all, because every single one of his lines had to be completely redubbed by another actor during post-production. The problem wasn't with Henry's acting ability or his line delivery, but rather with his distinctive Southern accent that made it impossible for audiences to believe he was a lifelong New York City police officer. Henry had been born and raised in the South, and despite his successful acting career, he had never lost the regional accent that marked him as clearly being from outside the Northeast. While this accent worked perfectly fine for many of his other roles, including his famous portrayal of Tarzan in 3 films during the 1920s-60s, it created a serious credibility problem for Soylent Green, since his character was supposed to be a native New Yorker who had spent his entire career working for the NYPD. The filmmakers discovered during the editing process that Henry's Southern drawl was so noticeable that it pulled audiences out of the story, making them focus on his accent rather than on the dystopian world they were trying to create. Since Sergeant Kulosik appears in multiple scenes throughout the film and has several important lines of dialogue, simply cutting his scenes wasn't an option, so the production team had to find a voice actor who could match Henry's physical performance while delivering the lines with an appropriate New York accent. This kind of extensive voice replacement was relatively uncommon in major studio productions, since it required careful synchronization work to make sure the dubbed dialogue matched Henry's lip movements on screen. The fact that the dubbing was done so seamlessly that most viewers never noticed the replacement demonstrates the skill of both the voice actor and the sound technicians who completed this challenging post-production work. Fact 14. Buildings from 3 different cities. The nighttime skyline of future New York City that appears in several scenes throughout Soylent Green is actually a clever composite that combines famous buildings from 3 completely different American cities, creating a fictional metropolitan landscape that audiences were never supposed to recognize as geographically impossible. The matte painting artists who created this futuristic cityscape took distinctive architectural landmarks from New York, Chicago, and San Francisco and blended them together to suggest the kind of massive urban sprawl that would exist in the overpopulated world of 2022. The most recognizable elements borrowed from other cities include Chicago's iconic Marina City Towers, which are the distinctive corncob-shaped residential buildings that rise along the Chicago River, and San Francisco's equally famous Transamerica Pyramid, which was actually still under construction when Soylent Green was being filmed in 1972. These buildings were chosen not because they had any connection to New York City, but because their unique and futuristic designs helped create the impression of a world where urban architecture had evolved to accommodate massive population density. This mixing of real buildings from different cities was a common practice in matte painting during the 1970s, since it allowed artists to create impressive cityscapes without having to design every building from scratch, while also ensuring that the fictional city would look appropriately grand and overwhelming. The artists were counting on the fact that most movie audiences wouldn't be familiar enough with the skylines of multiple major cities to notice that buildings from Chicago and San Francisco were appearing in what was supposed to be New York. The technique worked so well that this geographical mixing went largely unnoticed for decades, and it's only visible to viewers who know these cities well enough to spot the distinctive architectural features that clearly don't belong together in any real-world location. Fact 15. The prophetic environmental warnings came true. During Soylent Green's climactic scene, Detective Thorne desperately shouts his warning about the environmental collapse that has made cannibalism necessary, crying out, "Ocean's dying, plankton's dying." To anyone who will listen, and what seemed like science fiction speculation in 1973 has turned out to be a chillingly accurate prediction of real environmental disasters that scientists are documenting today. When the film was released, most audiences probably assumed that Thorne's warnings about oceanic collapse were simply dramatic exaggerations designed to make the movie's dystopian future seem more believable. However, research conducted over the past several decades has confirmed that human industrial activity has indeed devastated marine ecosystems on a scale that matches the fictional environmental catastrophe depicted in the film. Scientists now estimate that civilized humans have reduced the total mass of fish in Earth's oceans by approximately 90% compared to pre-industrial levels, representing one of the most dramatic examples of species depletion in the planet's history. Even more specifically, a 2010 study reported that phytoplankton populations, which form the foundation of the ocean's entire food chain, have declined significantly due to climate change and pollution, exactly as the movie predicted would happen. These microscopic organisms are crucial for ocean health because they produce much of the world's oxygen and serve as the primary food source for countless marine species, making their decline a genuine threat to the stability of marine ecosystems. The film's prediction that dying oceans would create global food shortages also appears to be coming true, as overfishing and environmental destruction have made it increasingly difficult for coastal communities around the world to rely on traditional fishing for their protein needs. While we haven't resorted to the extreme solution depicted in Soylent Green, the environmental warnings that seemed like pure fiction 50 years ago have proven to be remarkably prescient observations about the real consequences of industrial pollution and climate change.